This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And I want to start by saying we usually do a little bit about people passing. And this week there's been some friends and relatives who have left, but they've left their mark on the landscape. The wedding that I spoke about last week, Stuart Martin had a heart attack there and passed. And he was very much a part of our community with Sally Duncan, and he knew he had some heart problems, and he tried to live with that, and in a very friendly and wonderful way. Many of us had just spoken to him before he passed, and we will remember Stuart Martin as very much a part of this community. A very positive lifestyle. David Stigberg also passed fairly unexpectedly. He was a PhD in musicology who worked with Searle and did a lot of programming, GPS type programming, and was well known in the community, a choral person and bicyclist, and once again a family part of the community, and we will miss him. John Foreman also died. John Foreman was born in Decatur, grew up in this area, became a well-known journalist. Then he became an editor-in-chief, and eventually publisher of the News Gazette. He was well known in the community for not only being a newspaper person, but being part of the community. He was interred at Pisodum, where he married his wife, and that is a very interesting Catholic triumvirate. There were 3 centers that included Ivesdale, Pisodum, and Bonneville, and those 3 centers each had a school. I suspect that the Catholic population was somewhat different. For instance, Ivesdale was probably more Irish, and Pisodum probably more European, and but those 3 churches were a combination, and people grew up with those communities, often fairly much out in the boondocks. Ivesdale is more in the center of Ivesdale, but one of the things I noticed in Pisodum is that the names of the children are engraved on the back of the tombstones. And some places you'll go, you get Cyrillic crosses, and so you can sort out part of the ethnology of these people. And so John will be appreciated for a long time, and once again we sympathize with the families that will have lost their loved ones. Back to prairie preservation, we've been working with the 2nd Street dig, and it's also known as the 2nd Street detention basin, and it has been planted in a very friendly manner to quite a few prairie species around the edges of the trails. And the trails are interesting. They wind around and make you enjoy the trip down from University Avenue to Springfield and then through Scott Park in amongst the rising high-rises. I just want people to realize that this July peak won't last for very long. We'd like you to enjoy that site while these plants are there and identifiable. We have, as we've worked with the translocation of the pocket prairie, we've encountered quite a few people who are interested and curious, and just last night I was there with, perhaps it was the night before, I've lost track of things, but I think perhaps it was Friday night. I was weeding the newly established prairie. It's looking a little sickly, having been transferred so recently, but I was pleased to see that the lead plant had leaves starting to be green, and I also noticed that there were weeds, so I started to pull weeds, and then somebody came up and offered to help, and then we got together, and he happens to be chairperson of the Master Naturalist, and so we talk back and forth. The Master Naturalist teaches people about their native landscape, the soils, the geology, the biology, the wildlife, and it's run through ACES, what used to be the College of Agriculture, and that is very much appreciated. They also have a Master Gardener program which deals mainly with what's in your backyard, but more and more some of the nature is going into the backyard, either as a pollinator garden or garden or as a prairie proper, and sometimes as a mixture of both. So it was John Beegee who I was talking to, and we walked the corridor. So he is looking for places where the Master Naturalists can get internships and experience with nature. And this looks like an ideal site that needs to be maintained some. It doesn't need a lot of maintenance, but it is better if you do maintain and add a species or two. He also came across to what was the old pocket prairie to see what has been happening there. And we're still hoping that we might get some planter prairie in there, that using the plants that have shallow roots. Then you're not going to have a planter that has a 10-foot root for a compass plant, but you may have room for a monarda or something that's a little more showy and remind people of their heritage. I met with Kip Pope, and he has a little piece. He owns a little piece of on the end of the pocket prairie that faced Chestnut Street, and he's been a little reserved about it because it doesn't look like a regular garden, but he's interested in that staying there. He's seen it at the moment, and it is in its fine array. There is baptisia with white plumes. It's the dock plants. The leaves are showing. We've taken the culvert route to the 2nd Street dig, and it's blooming. But that little prairie will remain, and Kip would like to see that there's some sign on it which explains why it's different from a regular horticultural site. So that was pleasing, and that is also what the city is asking for in the 2nd Street dig. They'd like some explanation of what is there, and there is already some signage on the Scott Park which elicits a little bit of information about a rain garden that is also in amongst the prairie and the pollinators, and the opportunity for people to see locally what their heritage is. So we talked for quite some time. We weeded the prairie together because this is disturbed soil, and once you have disturbed soil, and especially if it's nice and moist and a little bit fertile as topsoil, then the ragweeds and other velvet weeds and others will grow quickly. We tend to pull them up because it's not easy to do anything else, but we tend to put our heel on the site so that the seed will have to encounter a more firm base. So prairie can handle a firm base. Some of the cultivated weeds like to be in soft, disturbed soil, and they certainly are growing there, and they will grow for perhaps 5 years while the rain helps to firm the soil, and gradually we hope to have a dominance of prairie. And it adds to the biodiversity of the prairie that's already been there, planted with the basin project, and it's probably about 5 years old. You have to know that some plants take a while to get their head together. Yellow coneflower usually takes about 4 years to all of a sudden blossom out, and that is happening on the 2nd Street dig at the moment. The flowers actually fall over the trail a little, which doesn't hurt. It gives it an atmosphere. You're intimately close to the yellow coneflower. There's also a sprinkling of purple coneflower. There's 2 types. One is more robust than the other, but they're getting to their peak, and the peak is passing. So if you want to see the coneflowers, then you need to be there soon. There's good parking, and 6 or 8 o'clock at night you can see people coming in, and they're enjoying that. The landscaping that's there and the waterfalls are also aeration devices. If you want to look at the boneyard from further north, you can go north of University Avenue and see how it comes under University Avenue and under a little prairie that takes water from runoff. And that prairie has in it butterfly weed and cardinal plants. The cardinal plants last night were looking wonderful. And they need a little more water than most, so I wonder if the runoff from the very slight rise nearby is enough to handle cardinal plants in a drought situation. So you have to dream about perhaps a little bit of pumped up water from the boneyard, which runs right underneath this little prairie. So you have a prairie on top of the boneyard, and the boneyard probably running with like two 8-foot diameter pipes and come out, and it's still a stream, but the stream is much lower than it used to be. It goes through a more natural area to the north where you have a stream and you don't have quite so many geese and ducks. It goes under a bridge under White Street and then comes out in a larger pond where most of the wildlife seems to accumulate. And it does feed on the lawns and the plants that are there. You go a little further south to Scott Park, and it is nicely landscaped so that the meander is there, and the people who helped to put that in have been wise enough to have a variety of the plants that you might expect in a rough, tough prairie. You're in a public area, so you're not going to be able to have purple gentian or some of the more refined plants unless you have a little greenhouse somewhere and you develop them and get them to a certain stage of maturity before you plant them out. And then if you do plant those ones out, you have to put a netting around them. And that netting has to be very small in diameter, because if you have a small rabbit, it can climb through an inch-sized netting and gobble up your efforts. But it's rather nice, and I want to encourage you to go over there. And I was pleased to meet with John Beattie, who might be able to provide some stewardship there, but also might be able to use the site as a training place for the members of the Master Naturalist program. We really appreciate that they do that. We, at the same time, have been up to the Pope Prairie at Rantoul, spot herbiciding, making sure that the teasel doesn't get away. But we also have a lot of sweet clover. Sweet clover is wonderful for pollinators, but it's not a very good plant for a prairie. It's not native. It's a introduced hay crop, and it does provide nectar and pollen for bees. And mostly those bees are Italian bees, not native bees. We've tried to keep it more native, and we're considering doing a summer burn on some sites that have an abundance of sweet clover. It's a white sweet clover at the moment. It will be shortly followed with a yellow sweet clover. But we need to keep our eyes on that, because if we don't, each plant has thousands and thousands of seeds, and once they land in the ground, it's very hard to get rid of them, and there's a seed pool for years to come. So I've been talking to Ron Sleater about that, and we'll probably go up to Rantoul and do a small burn. It's in the middle of summer, so your grasses are green, and there's going to be lots of white smoke, and that's always a problem. So you have to let the fire department know what you're doing and perhaps include them. And that often is a very friendly thing. The fire people come out, and if they have a crew, there's usually one or two members of the crew that want to stay in and find out a little bit more about this, because fire departments have begun to realize that now they're being asked to create a fire to burn off the excess litter, whereas in the past they used to have to put out the same area to protect the surroundings. And so if you go to somewhere like Milwaukee or further north, and you're looking for prairies, the best thing to do is go to the fire department, and they'll say, "Oh yes, we used to have to protect that area, but now we're asked to be a part of burning that area. Not every year, but once every 3 years or 5 years, depending on what the growth is. And you have to be very careful that you don't have highway traffic nearby that might run through a dense set of smoke and run into a stopped semi-trailer or something like that. There have been some tremendous accidents with the fire. You also have to make sure that your wind is traveling in the right direction away from housing, and you'll always have someone who has an allergy and doesn't really want to see the smoke. But the smoke for a prairie fire is usually short-lived, and it's not a dramatic fire like a bonfire, which more or less sterilizes the soil. But a good prairie fire goes quickly. There'll be a little bonfire every once in a while when it hits a dried plant like a big blue stem that's been established for a while, but that too will finish. And you tend to make your area rather small to start with. We start with something like a 10-foot area, so that it tests the wind. If the wind is more than 15 miles an hour, which you can sort of test by licking your finger and putting it in the air, and you get a feeling for how fast the wind is blowing. You have to watch how creative the wind is. If it's rambunctious, then it's going to be moving in one direction for one moment, and then to turn around, it's moving in another direction. And you have to watch the people who are doing the burning. It's very easy to light a lot of fire at once, but you have to watch to see that you're not closing in on someone who's a steward that doesn't realize that you're lighting a fire behind them and they're dealing with a fire in front. So you can very easily get caught between fires. So there's a lot of caution that goes on with making a fire, but I think the plants and the insects and the other creatures that occupy a remnant prairie deserve to have the fire that came to them by lightning over the centuries that they've been there. We're very pleased with the prairie because it is young, but the plants are forming little islands of organic matter, just the same way as they would have done 10,000 years ago when the glaciers moved away. And every so often, a new seed will come. At the moment, there are two types of liatris at Rantoul, and they put on a very nice display. It'll be probably 2 or 3 weeks before they reach their peak. But there's a button liatris which comes later, and there's the blazing star, which is just about ready to come now. And we do have natural history survey people who have been looking at snakes that find little second-hand living situations in crawdad holes. So we still have to portage our materials into this site. There's probably about 2,000 more feet of space that's been on an old road which has been closed off by the Department of Transportation. And that is very helpful to us because we constantly have people dumping there. And we've opted to keep the roadblocks there, but it means we have to portage our materials and water and herbicides and things like that in. some of the things that we do at Rantoul or Pope Prairie, we hope will extend 10 miles to Paxton on that same old road. The culverts have been removed for liability reasons. There's always a feeling that someone will fall off or jump off a culvert. So when the road is retired, the culverts and the bridges are usually removed. We've been lucky in the Monticello area to have made moves to buy 33-mile railroad bed before the bridges were taken out. So we have 3 truss bridges, very large bridges, and 27 trestles that are intact. Unfortunately, one section of the purchase was vacated early, and an almost brand new bridge was removed in order to cross Camp Creek. There we will have to put in a bridge. Some of these places have extra space of an interurban, and that's providing us with a rough idea of what a remnant prairie was like, and it's down to 0.01% of the prairie that was here. So, in the case of White Heath to Seymour, we have an organization called the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad, and we are re-railing that, so with the hope to get historic trains from the Railroad Museum, which is contiguous, to come into Champaign. That's a huge objective. It involves working with Canadian National to preserve about 7 miles of existing trackage between Seymour and Bonneville, and working with Federal Surface Transportation Board. The leader of the push is Tom Scott, who is a railroad engineer and who is also a very active member of the Monticello Railroad Museum. So that's working. Some of these corridors are in a region, and we're just in the process of losing 30 miles in the Arcola area, where the railroad bed was preserved by the Department of Natural Resources, basically for a trail, but it's also loaded with prairie, and the loss of that is quite a serious loss of some of our only remaining natural remnant prairie. At the moment, we had a phone call in last week when we were on the air from Joel McDonald. He was observing that the rail is being taken out between Mansfield, Farmer City, and Bloomington. In this case, you are looking for and hoping for some regional planning. Chicago does it very well. They have Open Lands Project and other agencies that advise and research these areas, and how do you get them to relate to each other is rather important. The Bloomington, 30 miles to Farmer City. At Farmer City, the trail is probably only about 7 miles away from the Heartland Pathways line that goes through DeLand, Weldon, Lane, and Clinton. So we need fairly desperately, but not to be too concerned, just to work at it slowly, to get a regional planning organization that can look at the Kickapoo Trail as it relates to the trails that are in the Monticello area, that relate to Allerton Park, relate to the road that might take bicycles to Decatur, the old Route 47. When you look at the Kickapoo Trail, it's extremely popular. We're very, very pleased. It did remove a lot of our native vegetation, so we're looking for a narrower phase, the next phase to be narrower. But when you go east and you're looking for sites that people will be interested in, there's not a lot. There's a lot of interest in the geology under the ground. So you have coal, and you have that coal has carboniferous area plants preserved in it. They don't last long if you open them up and open them to oxygen. They just disconvolvulate very quickly. But that's of interest, but it's not the sort of interest that is a public interest that's available to everyone. There's been strip mining there, and that provides some opportunity for four-wheelers and some recreational opportunities that are attractive. But when you turn around and look from the Kickapoo Trail across San Pedro and Urbana to Monticello and Clinton, you have a group of interests that are much more open to the general public. If you're in the Clinton area, it's the Clinton Power Plant Lake. There's if you go round by Allerton, there's the Allerton area and its natural areas, and heron rookeries and levee corridors that have been recently established. And you have in that direction also commercial interests. The Monticello is unique in that it had a pepsin factory, and that pepsin factory came from in the era of about 1900 when pepsin was discovered to be an enzyme that would help with constipation and diarrhea and things like that, and it was extremely valuable. It replaced things like mustard and other attempts to waylay those medical problems, but were much more harsh. So the pepsin factory grew, and this, you have to know, is a sort of a principle, an economic principle that grew in this country, so that you had someone who discovered something, and then a group of entrepreneurs got together and started to develop it. And in the case of Monticello, it got to be a factory of about that could handle about 250 or 300 people. So it's an industrial, early settlement industrial record that eventually resulted in Monticello having a $1 million State Street with houses where the stable is big enough for a house, and the house is huge. And this product, which is still, you know it as Pepto-Bismol. They had about 8 pharmaceuticals there, but this was history, and I was very sad that the community took the pepsin factory down, because it was a monumental piece of history that, in a way, develops your history for the area. So if people are bicycling across the country and they want to stop at Monticello, one of the pieces of history was that this was a paradigm where you had an inventor, entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs' children got to be going to universities, and so it went out of the hands of local people into multinationals, and then the factory was somewhat obsolete because it was it took in materials from 5 stories at the top, you put in your product. You had to boil it and extract the enzyme. You had to add some sugar and add some alcohol, so it was a little bit easier to utilize. Then you had to have it combined and packaged in bottles, and then packaged in cardboard, and then you had to have a railhead to take it out to around the world. That, to me at least, was a rather important piece of history, and the sort of thing that people would come to see, and it has tourist value. Well, it looked a little worn down, and it's easy to teach people that it is decrepit, but and it needed at least $50,000 into the roof, and so it was much easier to remove that pepsin factory. But it was a historic monument, and by the time we were considering the preservation of that building, there were other buildings that were vacated so that industries would take their product overseas where it could be produced at a lower price. So you had these empty grayfield buildings, and they're not easy to deal with. You can't put a bunch of retail shops in them. You more have to apportion them to some apartments. You have to have people who are dressed in the period costumes. You will have to have demonstration equipment. It might be to the point of having some of the product available. The railhead is there. So you have to think about things other than just natural history when you're going to attract tourist money, and that may be a little financial, but it's also very, very friendly, and people get to ask you, what was your heritage here? Why did you have a state street with such large houses that they're too big for a small family, but not big enough for a university to have a conference center? There's these little nuances that make the story interesting, and that leads to someone having a restaurant or a shop that they will utilize. And it's near to the river, so you have to deal with the Sangamon and the retention of the Sangamon. And if you want to get into the Sangamon at Mohammed and go to Allerton Park, it's going to take you about 6 or 8 hours to negotiate, even in spring when the water is high. But if you're going to do it in summertime when the water is low, you're going to encounter all sorts of snags and the like. But these are the sorts of things that make tourism valuable, and that keeps communities healthy. It allows overseas people to realize what you do or did in settlement times. It gives you a chance to have some prairie. We have a nice little prairie from Monticello's through to Cisco, and if you're lucky, you will stumble over purple gentian in the fall. That is, for us, a rather rare plant, but we know where it is, and it's right next to a library. And so how do you maintain its base and keep it to be natural within 100 yards of a building that's utilized? How do you think about putting a trail through that corridor and keeping it so narrow that the plants will remain? So we're talking to the Land Conservation Foundation initiated by Bruce Hannon, but it goes back to the time where Paxton and others were inviting Judge Douglas to come to look at the site for a possible reservoir that would have taken over a lot of Elton Park and Friends Creek. So this organization is gradually organized into a foundation which does things like buy up an old levee and allow it to be a walkway for a trail, and allows the plants to rejuvenate, whereas those levees were often there to provide an opportunity for farmland. So on Monday we'll be meeting with people from the Lands Conservation Foundation to discuss some of these sorts of things. And we're pleased to sort of think that the natural history is becoming more acceptable, even though in the last 50 years we've lost a huge amount of the remnant prairie that is so much more biodiverse than anything like a replanted prairie. A restoration prairie is quite okay. It helps people to understand what a prairie is, and it attracts a lot of insects, butterflies, and creatures. And around it you get people who have to deal with some of the nature. And this week I was talking to Carrie, and Carrie has found that they had a possum that was living in a barn, and the possum may have had a conflagration with dogs or something like that, and it died. But in the barn there were these little creatures, and there were 10 of them. So mother was now gone, so they have been feeding the possums. And then Carrie goes south to Anna area in southern Illinois, where there are peaches and products that they sell at the farmers market are produced. And the operator there said, "There's a dead possum there, but there's 4 babies alongside it." So then they gathered up the 4 babies and bring them back. These particular babies were somewhat more mature. Their eyes were open, and they knew how the world worked some. But now they have a best part of 15. I forget the exact number, but they have a lot of baby possums. And what do you do with these creatures as you grow up? Because one of the targets that they're going to elicit in the rural situation is going to be your chickens. So possums are not endangered. They do look at you with open mouth, and they play possum dead, and they're interesting. Some people will eat them. They're loaded with fat to protect them, so they can hibernate in the wintertime and survive. But they can be a nuisance. So then people have to think about, do they or do not they preserve these little creatures? And as we get more people involved in natural history, you have to encounter those sorts of problems, a little bit like having to get rid of sweet clover, which was a farm plant that was wonderful. Things are changing. And it's a little bit like now people are planting milkweeds, and if you go to someone who's in their 80s, then and as a child they had to spend their lives digging out milkweed and other weeds. So it's a changing universe, and the possums may be a part of that.
15 minutes.
So we still are having to locally deal with our inspection of the building, which is an old building in amongst a city that is gentrifying and growing huge office buildings and apartments all around, and we have to think about how we survive and how we keep a niche for nature in a very urban setting. There are perhaps even thousands of people sitting around enjoying a beer, but they also are interested at the same time. So they come past and they enjoyed like crazy the little pocket prairie we're losing to a beer bar or a beer garden. That's not all negative. It's part of the act. So how do we take off our front facade? Our front facade parallels one that was in front of Weft. Weft took theirs off and put back a facade that is very much part of the era when these rows of two buildings, two sets of buildings. There are 8 buildings on Market Street, and there were 8 buildings on Walnut Street, and they backed onto each other with a 40-foot lane between the two. And they were all brick because this area was subject to, if you had nice, dry lumber buildings, they did catch on fire. So you had cisterns sitting around where there was water so that you could pump water out. The fire departments didn't have the modern-day trucks that they have now and then the ladders and the like, so you had to do what you could. And so many communities lost a lot of their wooden buildings, including in Chicago. And this is what we have here. In some cases, the facade that was in existence when the buildings were built was not in keeping with the modern thought for facades. So there are 2 buildings in this row that have had 2 or 3 feet of additional front to create a buff rather than a black hog's hair mortar. So what do we do with that? We have to think, can we take off our front facade? There was for us, there was a 2 or 3 feet portion of extended building that Weft had. Weft took it off, and their facade in front is quite nice as a result. So how do we deal with that? How do we upgrade the front? We need journeymen who know how to handle the bricks and mortar. We need the journeymen to know how the added facade on the building next door relates to us. We certainly have to do something with fire hazards that we have. We have some material parked too close to sprinklers. We have, if you want to get fire department people in, you need corridors that are wide enough to haul a fire hose through. So we need to think about modernizing and fitting into the gentrification area. The building across from Weft and Heartland Pathways, it may be a future historic. Well, it will be a historic. It'll be a probably modern apartments. There are a number of people in historic groups that would like to see Market Street retain a little of its history. So can that building be remodeled? And that means that some of you have to be interested enough to look at it. We have a lot of recycled materials. People don't always know where to go. We don't have a recycling center anymore. We don't have a facility for commercial materials that come out of buildings like the one that's being developed across the road. We have places to send batteries, but the people don't always know where to take them, and sometimes they don't wish to spend the time to preserve things. So you have computers going into the garbage, going to the landfill because there's no opportunity to do anything else or willingness to do anything else, and the city runs perhaps 2 collection periods on a Saturday, and not everyone makes it. It's a huge event, and there's much more recyclable material out there than there is an opportunity to recycle. Clothes go to places where there are opportunities for resale, but many of the clothes that we collect from the street, where street people have left them and things like that, are dirty, and we can't afford to pay the dry cleaning costs or the laundry costs to do anything other than to bale those materials. So baling becomes helpful, but baling would send the baled materials to places like China, and they've decided to not accept that sort of material anymore. So what do you do? How do you look at it? You need to be going to city meetings and to at least talk about these things. Pallets. I see many pallets going to the landfill, and the comment is that the people at the landfill use these as pallets to put materials on. Well, we don't really, as far as I know, have one of those organizations where you have a bunch of elderly people who take upon their souls to salvage metal and salvage materials. That doesn't mean you're going to get everything, because if it's a piece of furniture, it gets compacted and it doesn't exist anymore. But there is the day when we'll have an organized group of people who have liability insurance and that can work with simple bulldozers to see what comes in with a garbage truck and starts to sort it. And that's a costly way of doing things, but it's important. Better yet is to have sustainability. You build a building with materials that you know that can be salvaged in a certain way, whether it's steel or wood, and buildings get awards for being LED awards for doing that sort of sustainability. There are little things like most bars do not have a city ordinance that says that the cans and bottles should be separated from garbage. And you might get the cans and the bottles together, but often they all are in the garbage. And many of the time, we take out like 200 cans out of a dumpster, and there must be a mountain of aluminum in the landfill at Clinton. We need to do something that suggests to the architects that when you're designing a bar, there should be a place for cans to be recycled, so that there can be salvage. There also has to be some way of collecting them. When we had a junkyard downtown, it was always an anathema because you don't want a junkyard in your backyard. But what a junkyard does is it allows people to walk or drive their materials in a little at a time. If you put the junkyard 3 miles out of town, then you have to have a vehicle, and you have to accumulate enough to make it worthwhile to visit the salvage yard, and that doesn't always happen. So once you lose that yard, you lose a lot of the opportunity for salvage. The alternative is to have a recycling center like we used to have, and it's costly, and often it gets used by people who don't pay taxes for it. And if you're paying $170,000 a year for a salvage base and 10 societies around utilize it without paying taxes, then you close that opportunity. So somehow you have to have a regional planning that says, communities around, if we do this, we want you to do some of your own and contribute to this overall paradigm.
Less than 2 minutes.
Okay, well, I think you're getting some of the same things as we normally talk about, but that's okay. It's continuous, and we want you to be reminded that you need to think about these sort of opportunities, and it's part of a family of man. And if you have a recycling center, often it's the place where people meet and talk to each other. So the Stuart Martins and the David Stigwards and the John Formans will meet there and exchange. And some of those people will also interact at a different level where it's an organizational level, and they will take their message there. And so this sort of interaction, this sociology is important to keep afloat. It's time. Thanks for listening. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk. Dave on
the board. And I wasn't here at the beginning to mention that first, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no